Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second of our FTSE webinar series on a thriving Murray-Darling Basin in 50 years and what actions we might be seeking to take for the future. I'm John Radcliffe and I'm a co-editor and a co-host of this event, and I'm joined by Therese Flapper, who will also be co-hosting and who will later in the afternoon be leading the Q&A session. First of all, we should begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. And in my case, it's the land of the Kaurna people in the Adelaide Plains. And we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And especially we welcome any participants today with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander heritage. I'll just say something quickly about the Academy, which has over 900 fellows. It's independent and non-political, and it likes to think it's uniquely placed to contribute to public debate from an evidence-based foundation, bringing forward a wide range of expertise from its fellows. And it's divided up in state divisions and also specialist forums, one of which involved in this exercise has been the Water Forum. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan has been under increasing scrutiny in recent years, and the Water Forum felt that we should really look much further to the future. So we invited eminent fellows in the Academy and other recognised scholars prepare a series of essays on various aspects of the vision for the basin, adopting a 50-year horizon. Now, what have been the outputs of that process? Firstly, we've published the book of essays on the web. It's 246 pages. You can see on your screen to the right the cover of it, and you're welcome to download it and hope you might find it of interest. Secondly, we have a 6-page summary leaflet, which we have used in a press program, summarising all of the essays, and it's also available as hard copies. A third component is this webinar series, of which this is the second one. But we also like to think that the whole exercise will be a potential input to the 2026 review of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. I would just like to remind you of the speakers that we had last week, which are available on a recording that you can get down from the FTSE website. And the speakers are shown here on the screen and listing the expertise that they bring to the debate. Now, if we go to today's speakers, you will see that Therese and I will deal with the introduction, the key findings and an Indigenous perspective. John Verhoeven from the University of New South Wales will talk about water quality. John Williams from ANU and previously a divisional chief in CSIRO will discuss surface groundwater connectivity. John Koehn from Charles Sturt University, but previously from the Arthur Rylah Institute in Victoria, will describe freshwater fish and river ecosystem issues. Luke Mosley from the University of Adelaide will talk about the specifics of the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth. And finally, to address the long-term future of industries operating and developing in the basin, we have Carl Larsen, a consultant from RMCG. And I would remind you to put in the Q&A section of your screen any questions that you would like to put to individual speakers as we go along, so that we have a good range of questions for the discussion at the end. So now let me formally introduce Therese to talk about a summary of the Academy's principal findings from today's exercise.
Good afternoon, and thank you, John, and thank you to everyone who's joining us from around many locations. I will go quickly through our summary. As John has alluded, many of these documents are available on our website, and you can read them in full detail at your leisure. One of the things that was quite critical to us from this work was not only the wonderful and great work from a range of essayists from a broad range of areas across the basin, but looking for those common actionable recommendations and findings that could be gleaned from each and every essay. And from that, we found 3 key messages, 7 recommendations, and 10 principles for adaptation that can be applied for the basin's future. This is, of course, quite timely given the recent and ongoing inquiries into both the Murray-Darling Basin Plan Review, as well as the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water with a new National Water Agreement. On the slide, and the next slide, is a summary of the key findings that we did draw from these essays, and you can read about those in more detail in the website. These are able to be actioned into policy, and we do hope that policy is uptaken in a way that considers these findings. We need to have agreed and inclusive assessment timeframes. They need to require a climate change with long-term impact modelling for water quality as well as quantity. We need to include integrated land and water management strategies. We, of course, must consult and consider the modelling of cumulative effects over time, space, and location. We need to ensure stakeholder representation that is not just by government, but by the many, many types and forms of consultation that should occur with the various stakeholders across industry and communities. This should all be wrapped within a robust risk assessment framework, inclusive and including principles of ESG, and ensure progressive evaluation. And I'm quite happy to see that many of these principles really are reflected in the Basin Plan Review document that has been released in terms of an early insights paper and the Department's National Water Agreement draft principles as well. Having said that, what we also have been working towards is ensuring and seeing how we can accommodate the Indigenous perspective. And for more on that, I'll hand back to John Radcliffe. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. When we originally established the whole project, we sought to get some essays written with an Aboriginal experience and perspective. And we had 2 people accepted the invitation, but sadly, both of them had to withdraw because of the pressure on their time, because of their involvement in the debate then going on over the Voice to Parliament. So we decided to review the Aboriginal literature ourselves as best we could, and we had the result, which we published, reviewed by 2 people well experienced in Aboriginal culture and participation. So the principal issues are, we need to recognise that there are 50 groups of Aboriginal communities or First Nations that have been living in the Murray-Darling Basin for thousands of years. The river is central to their creation and identity, but they were displaced by European settlers. The rights and responsibilities they'd had for managing the river in their own environment were ignored by a colonial land title system that was set up by the new arrivals. What that now means that less than 1% of the basin is owned by First Nations people, and most of the people with that land don't actually have access to water. So First Nation people and their opportunity to participate in decision making has only occurred quite recently. They now participate in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. They are contributing to water resource plans which state agencies are preparing, and the Commonwealth has a committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander water issues. But at the end of all of it, currently, only 0.02% of the water entitlements issued on the Murray-Darling Basin are actually held by people with Indigenous heritage. So what they seek is more governance and empowerment, and that to some ways is reflected in the 2007 Echuca Declaration. And they particularly seek recognition for cultural flows to improve their spiritual, cultural, environmental and social circumstances. But I think it's also important that they have the opportunity to develop economic activities for their future livelihood as a result of water available to them. That being said, I'd now like to move to the next presentation, which will be given by John Verhoeven, who will talk about water quality. John.
Good afternoon. Thank you, John, and thank you to the Academy for the opportunity to present at today's webinar. And I acknowledge my co-authors, Professor Stuart Koehn and Dr Megan Evans. Quality has a material impact on the effective amount of water available to meet water supply, cultural, environmental, social and industrial water uses in the Murray-Darling Basin. As climate change is already reducing stream flow and degrading water quality, it's important to elevate water quality protection and management to meet future water uses. Now, water quality varies widely across the basin, and it's the result of its many diverse landscapes, of the introduction of European land use, including irrigation and the construction of major dams, and of climate and climate change impacts. Within the basin, impacts on water quality vary between the northern and the southern basins as a result of differences in climate and climate change impacts, in hydrological characteristics, and of differences between the states in water security and availability. While our focus has been on surface water and groundwater quality, the surface groundwater interactions and impacts on water availability and on ecosystem health are important for basin water management. Various sources of water, their magnitude and quality that contribute to surface water and groundwater include rainfall, runoff, snowmelt, groundwater recharge and discharge, irrigation return flows, and discharges from towns, mining and other industries. The risks to water quality of each of these sources varies from catchment to catchment, between wet and dry years, and over time with climate and other anthropogenic changes. Now, current basin water quality condition can be described by 6 major primary threats: increasing salinity, nutrients, sediments, metals and other toxic chemicals, temperature, and low dissolved oxygen concentrations. They can also be described by 2 major consequential threats: cyanobacteria blooms and toxins and blackwater events. And we've noted too an emerging threat, which is the increasing incidence of pathogens. Now, water quality condition in the southern basin is highly variable, with quality generally deteriorating progressively, moving downstream and over time. One notable exception to this, though, is salinity in the River Murray, which has decreased over the last 30 years. And this demonstrates the value to water quality of implementing a long-term basin-wide salinity management strategy. What of the future? We used hydroclimate metrics presented in the essay in Hydroclimate to identify water use vulnerabilities and threats to future basin water quality under climate change. Specifically, we looked at a warmer and drier climate with rainfall decreased by 10% and with a more severe multi-year droughts. We found that the ability to provide fit-for-purpose water quality for all uses will be more difficult than at present, providing a challenge for the basin and for its management. Various climate change impacts were predicted to increase all the primary threats to basin water quality. For example, higher temperatures will impact physical, biological, and biogeochemical processes affecting water quality. And the saturated DO concentrations will be lower and thermal stratification will be stronger. A combination of the various climate change impacts were predicted to increase consequential threats, including increasing the occurrence, frequency, extent, and duration of cyano blooms, increasing the concentration of cyanotoxins in waterways, and a greater chance of blackwater events. Next slide, please. Water quality presents the challenges and opportunities for adaptive management of the basin through the integrated use of policy, management, and technology. to reduce uncertainty for various uses and adapt to climate change. Comprehensive volumetric water policy and management reforms for the basin provided a starting point for improved water management in the 2000s, but they addressed water quality issues in only a limited way and did not consider climate change. A major change in approach is required. We've made 9 recommendations to deliver basin water quality outcomes as part of a water quality policy framework. And some of these are included in the Academy's gleanings, which we've already heard. The recommendation is to develop a multi-level natural resources risk-based governance framework for the basin to coordinate and integrate land and water management, water volumetric, water quality and ecosystem management, surface water and groundwater systems and their connectivity. All of this in a hierarchy of basin, catchment and sub-catchment plans. The second is to assess climate change indirect impacts on water quality and quantity, including changes to catchment vegetation, changes to fire regimes, and changes to water chemistry. These impacts have the potential to create new water quality issues and risks to water uses. Third is to develop or update water quality and quantity objectives and specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound, or SMART targets for basin water users, and to evaluate their vulnerability to future changes. Targets should be consistent across the basin, while outcomes and implications of monitoring and modelling should be reported regularly and promptly to governments and communities to help maintain their commitment and involvement. Fourth, to assess multiple climate change scenarios, their risks and impacts on water availability, and surface water, groundwater connectivity, and options for future users' vulnerabilities to identify and manage the risks of water quality degradation. The fifth recommendation is to assess climate change scenarios using a 50-year long-term perspective to develop actions that should be taken over the next 10-year iteration of the basin plan to improve its long-term adaptability and to provide a longer-term perspective to risk to secure reforms and investments. Next slide, please. The sixth recommendation is to develop, evaluate, and implement comprehensive, long-term, integrated water quality and quantity management strategies for water quality issues, including cyano blooms and black water events, using the successful approach of the Basin Salinity Management Strategy 2030. This strategy shows the value of long-term bipartisan and bilateral agreements at Commonwealth and state governments levels, and the commitment of and resourcing by governments at all levels. Seventh, to develop and implement integrated land and water management measures or integrated catchment management to optimise sustainable basin water quality outcomes. Eighth, to upgrade water volumetric and water quality monitoring, use double entry water accounting for both quality and quantity, develop a new basin-wide model to replace the various state agency models, conduct independent and transparent reviews and audits, and make water data publicly available. These measures are necessary to provide better accounting for uncertainties in the basin water balance and better predictive capacity for water managers. The final recommendation is to assess what policy and institutional arrangements are needed for effective basin water quality, quantity, and ecosystem management. And this includes public participation and community involvement, policy coordination and integration, communication, transparency, and potentially institutional change. Now, bringing all this together, our 9 recommendations must be implemented together to deliver a healthy basin having water quality and quantity needs for all users. Our approach requires long-term bipartisan and bilateral agreements at Commonwealth and state governments levels, and the commitment of and resourcing by governments, communities, and industries. And our recommendations require elevating water quality protection and management to optimise fit-for-purpose water having different qualities to meet consumptive and environmental water use objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that very broad-based review for the future. Now, many of the community, of course, are very well aware of the surface water in the river and how it's used, but many of them are not particularly familiar with the concept of groundwater, and yet the relationship between the two of them is very important. And I'd like John Williams to discuss today the long-term view of the surface groundwater connectivity relationship that we need to continue to follow and develop over the next 50 years. John Williams.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I'm most grateful to the work that John and Teresa have done over a long time to bring all this together. Thank you very, very much for that. I do appreciate it. I'd first have liked to also acknowledge Andrew Ross, who came in and led this work with me when it was a difficult time during the last months of my wife's life. So thank you, Andrew, for standing in and making it possible. I guess the thing I'd say, as John has said, and John Radcliffe has said, and John Verhoeven very nicely made the points many times, that the integrated management of groundwater, surface water in the channels, the floodplains and the wetlands and the aquifers as a connected system is essential for human environmental purposes. And one of the really important reasons, if we look at the whole system and see it as a living system, it becomes very evident to all the different interest groups that have a responsibility and a commitment to the water resource management and its use. You see then, when you look at the whole system, you see the various users come into perspective. And that's what's so important, to see the groundwater system and the surface water connected through the way floodplains and aquifers interact and wetlands interact with aquifers and aquifers interact with the channel. That's so fundamental to what we have. And yet, in many ways, the policy frame that's in the current Murray-Darling Basin has provision for this. But at the moment, the water resource plan, which is fundamental to each catchment, do not actually deal with the management of the integrated connected system. It couldn't be done, it needs to be done. Now, the use of groundwater, which is supporting unregulated river flow, leads to stream flow depletion, which is really compounded in drier seasons and will be terribly important to build that into our understanding of climate change, as John Verhoeven has so clearly outlined in his talk. So that's absolutely important, that we recognise the groundwater and its supply and its recharge mechanism. The recharge mechanism of the groundwater system is so importantly determined in many instances by the flood routines that the surface water has, and the way, in fact, those two things interact. Critical, of course, in all of this is identifying the risks that climate change brings to us, the irrigation extraction, the floodplain harvesting, the afforestation to a lesser extent, coal seam gas and coal mining, all interact on this whole living system, which we call the river system of surface water and groundwater and the floodplains that make it happen. The most at-risk groundwater system, as far as we can tell from our analysis in the Murray-Darling Basin, are those that are based around a sedimentary and alluvial systems. That's where the connections are most important, the old prior stream connections and likewise. And there is a shortage of data and assessment related to this connected system, particularly in the water resource plans. The water resource plans tend often to have a focus on surface water extraction and then a separate one for the groundwater extraction. These water balance needs to be brought together in the National Resource Plan. If we can go to the second slide, and I'll move on to the actual findings. The really big task ahead of us is to find ways to get the water resource planning process integrated into the basin plan, and particularly connected to the risk management framework that better describes and defines the groundwater surface water connectivity in these water resource plans and recognise its long-term impact and its impact with climate change. The basin plan needs to have in it the recognition of the indicators of this connectivity. In some, the connectivity will be dreadfully important. In others, it will be less important, and that will affect the time frame of the impact on the water resource. I feel that the basin plan must include an agreed time frame for estimating the water balances and their cumulative impacts over a long time. We need to have the water balances in the water resource plans and done in a connected way. The plan needs to be determined in consultation with stakeholders. That's so self-evident. But if we look at the system as a whole, the surface and the groundwater, the floodplains, the wetlands, the recharge mechanism, the discharge mechanisms, and then we see all the different users and groups who have an interest in this water resource, we'll see how they fit together better. And it's important that all these stakeholders and interest groups, particularly including our Indigenous First Nation people, but also the people of different interests who see the water system to have values in spiritual as well as commercial, as well as recreational, and as well as health values. If we see it as this connected whole system, we have a better idea of the players that we need to interact with and understand. And of course, we need to have an economic recognition of a sociable charge for water use. That's a big issue and one we want to take up. And to make this possible, we need the improved coordination across basin states with attention to bringing new knowledge. Our knowledge of the interaction between the groundwater, its recharge mechanisms, and the surface water is far from sufficient. It's not an easy area, it's a tough area of hydrology, and it's expensive. But when we do get the connections and the recharge mechanisms and the discharge mechanisms fully and better understand, and we need to have provision in the modelling, as John Verhoeven said, are models that are whole system and can be upgraded with time as our knowledge improves. So that's what we're looking for, that we want an extended framework for accessing groundwater, surface water connections across the impacts of increasing extractions on the connected water cells and the ecosystems, which facilitates such considerations much more fully incorporated in the water resource planning processes and the water resource plan. This, to us, this modification of the water resource plan to be more comprehensive, to have the water connections understood, and to have a water balance, I believe are the cornerstones of the new basin plan. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I appreciate again the work that Andrew did to bring this together for our paper. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Teresa.
Thank you very much, John Williams, for your presentation, which we appreciate the detail and the proposals that you suggest we need to be following in looking to the future. Now let's look a little more closely at the actual water itself, because the water in the river and even in the groundwater is an ecosystem of significance. I'd like to invite John Koehn to explore with us the freshwater aquatic systems which are operating within the river itself. John Koehn.
Thanks very much, John, and good afternoon, everyone. When we hear or read about the Murray-Darling Basin, it's most likely about agricultural production, which is an impressive, $30 billion a year. Indeed, irrigation and agricultural development has dominated both the discussions and the management of the Murray-Darling Basin to date. We must remember, however, that the basin's natural environments include many important ecological assets, and these are assets that belong to all Australians. We have the two of Australia's longest rivers, the Murray and the Darling, and all their floodplains, internationally listed wetlands, red gum forests, waterbirds, bats, frogs, reptiles, mammals, and about 50 species of native fish. Now that's 50 and still counting, because we're still describing some of the nuances for some of the taxa there. This talk is unashamedly about fish, and fish are a very good indicator of river condition. Many are at the top of the food chain, and they cover a variety of the habitats. And let's face it, everyone loves fish, and people love to go fishing. City and rural folk alike, irrigators, farmers, business owners, kids, adults, grandparents, the lot. Fish helps bring people of the basin and outside the basin together. So while the natural assets of the basin have received much less attention and management than irrigation itself, they have been greatly affected and impacted by both it and a range of other threats. The Sustainable Rivers audit shows that most river reaches and most wetlands are considered to be in poor condition. And when we come to native fish, those in the Murray-Darling Basin are under great threat. Native fish populations overall have been estimated to have declined by more than 90% since European settlement. Almost half, that's half of the native species now conservation listed. In particular, smaller fishes, particularly those wetland specialists, are at greater risk, and this is exampled by the small Yarra pygmy perch, which now appears to be extinct from the basin, having copped a hammering in South Australia during the millennium drought. But there have also been rapid declines in many key flagship species, such as silver perch, particularly in the northern basin, and the likely loss of both silver perch and Murray cod from the Paroo River. There have also been many, many fish kills, the largest in our history that we know of, and those fish kills are increasing in both magnitude and frequency. In 2023, over 4 million native fish died in the lower Darling River. That's 4 million. Imagine if that had occurred in Darling Harbour in Sydney or in South Bank in Melbourne. What an outcry there would have been. A quarter of fish species in the basin are now alien. And of these, as everyone knows, carp dominate the fish biomass in many river reaches and in many habitats. So with all this, there's been a significant losses to environmental, cultural, scientific, social, recreational, biodiversity, commercial, and economic values that these fish bring. So we're not just talking about fish in their own right, but we're talking about all of those other values, and most of those values are never explicitly included in planning. So none of this is good news, and it really indicates an ecosystem that is under a huge amount of stress. Next slide, thanks. The Murray-Darling Basin has 240 dams, our water storages, and the value of that current stored water on an average price is about $500 million, and it's probably north of that. The Murray-Darling is now one of the most regulated river basins in the world, and this has meant major changes to its river flows. For example, only 40% of main stem rivers remain free-flowing. Most have got a dam of some sort. Most of those river systems also have their hydrology altered by some degree, either regulation or water extraction. Under natural flow conditions, the end of system flows was zero for about 1% of time. So it's only 1% of time under natural conditions water would not have been flowing out to the sea, and that's now 40% of the time. Critical low flow or no flow periods have increased in many naturally perennially flowing rivers, and that includes the Darling, which indeed would have even had some flow during the millennium drought. The effects of these flow alterations were obviously most blatant during the millennium drought, but we might got to remember that they will be further exacerbated by climate change, along with extreme events. And climate change, as we've heard, is not currently properly accounted for in the basin plan, and that needs to be rectified. So in addition to the flow changes, there are also much infrastructure. So there are more than 4,000 major barriers that cause disruption to river connectivity in the rivers, and that means that spawning runs for fish, larvae moving downstream, are all impacted by that. There are also many, many minor barriers such as road culverts, access to wetlands and the like. More than 3,500 kilometres of MDB rivers are impacted by cold water releases from dams. This impacts spawning, recruitment and growth of our, what we would call warm water fishes. So it's generally 300 to 400 kilometres downstream of every major storage. This is a water quality issue for fish. So whether we like to admit it or not, the greatest threats to native fish come from water management or its infrastructure, but there are also many other non-water threats. Habitat loss and degradation, the removal of woody habitat, snags from the rivers, loss of riparian zones, sedimentation and the like. There's also been significant loss of off-stream lakes and wetlands. For example, in Western New South Wales, only about 2% of deflation basins, which are potentially really good golden perch nursery sites, are still operating. We also now have 12 alien species that we're trying to deal with, and they often cause some impacts to native fish. So by any assessment, this ecosystem is currently not being managed in a sustainable way, in an ecologically sustainable way, nor is it resilient and capable from bouncing back from extreme events. And we know there are going to be more of those events with climate change. Slide 3, thanks. The good news is we do have solutions to improve this situation. But firstly, we need to immediately recognise the need for restoration. This situation is pretty dire and it's getting worse. Then we need investments to undertake actions, to actually do something. We need to rectify this, because if we ignore it as we are, we're just leaving this to our children to fix up. So the basin plan guides water reform and flows, but we actually need more than this. We need water plus other actions. Indeed, the basin plan's implementation has been slow, as we know, and it's really hard to judge its successes yet. But it must include climate change, and it must be complemented by a comprehensive program of targeted investments to address these other threats. So we need improved flow management, and we're working on that. The timing of peaks, for example, the timing of other critical flow triggers that fish need. You can actually design flow hydrographs to maximise the benefits from these. That could use irrigation water delivery, for example. We need to do more to restore habitats, protect refuges, reinstate snags, revegetate banks, things like that. Water infrastructure, revised dam outlets, screening of pumps and diversions so we don't lose fish out of the river system, installing fishways, modifying weir operations, and managing species like carp. These are all solutions that have been shown to work and can make a difference. We must work across the jurisdictions and with the support and engagement of both communities and stakeholders. And both of those groups have very, very high interest in fish. We need a long-term view and with adequate funding to address the actions that need to be undertaken. We know what to do. We just need the investment and the commitment to do it. We also need to continue to maximise outcomes from environmental water that's being used. And this takes some ongoing science and some improved operations, but that is moving on at a reasonable pace, and there's lots of gains being made there. So in summary, this is about sustainable, resilient aquatic ecosystems that can survive and bounce back from extreme events, and especially being able to cope with climate change. Is to provide for the socio-ecological as well as the socio-economic needs for the future and for future generations. There is a need to have a more balanced approach to the MDB that includes these ecosystems so that we can leave a better legacy. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for a rather challenging view of where we might be having to head in the next 50 years. Now, don't forget to put your questions into the Q&A segment of your website, because we do want to have a very good discussion of some of the issues that have been raised with considerable importance during the course of our presentations. So we'll now move on to another area of particular economic or particularly environmental sensitivity, and that is the matter of the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, that brings together the freshwater and the marine environment, but also interacts very much internationally with such matters as the international bird flyways, which come to Australia as part of their breeding habitat. So can I invite Luke Mosley to develop for us a perspective for the future of the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth?
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks to everyone attending online in the webinar today, and also ATSE for putting together what I consider very important to do these whole of basin integrated assessments and looking at various issues and also proposing solutions. So I'm based here in South Australia. I do a lot of my research and consulting work in the lower lakes in the Coorong, and yeah, shown on the screen here, the lower lakes in the Coorong are right at the bottom end of the Murray-Darling Basin. So everything that happens upstream, good and bad, affects us down here in the lower lakes in Coorong, and it's a really important place, as John touched on. It is a Ramsar listed ecosystem. It's got internationally significant bird species. In fact, in drought years, it's a really important refuge for most of the birds in the Murray-Darling Basin. It is also incredibly important for First Nations communities. There's local, still very strong connected communities from the Nurrinjeri and the First Nations of the Southeast people down the southern end of the Coorong, who have a huge stake in this region. It's also got really important local fisheries, and also irrigators spread right around the lower lakes that use water out of the lower lakes, and obviously that supports the regional economy. Just a brief description maybe, because I'll talk about some things if people aren't familiar really with what I'm talking about. You can see the River Murray coming here on the map into two lakes, Lake Alexandrina and Lake Albert. You'll hear me talk about the lower lakes, and then you'll hear me talk about barrages, and these are these engineering structures here that separate essentially, you can see in this photo here, the lake water on the right hand side from the seawater on the left hand side. And then from that point, the water enters into the Coorong, which is this long, not very wide, shallow lagoon, which gets increasingly more hypersaline or saline as it moves away from the Murray mouth. We'll go to the next slide, thanks. Yeah, so the key findings of our assessment in this ATSE report is really, over the last century, like other parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, but probably more so given we're right at the end of the system and really vulnerable to upstream river regulation and water extraction. But there has been over a 40%, or flows are only 40% of what they were naturally. And perhaps most importantly, we're not getting as much large flows. We're only getting around 11% of the flows we used to get over 10,000 gigalitres a year. So that has had quite significant effects on water quality, but also on ecology, and resulted in quite acknowledged ecological decline of the system of this internationally important Ramsar site. The basin plan, was a hugely positive development, but some of the predictions of the amount of increased flow that would result from water recovery haven't occurred to the level that they were predicted to. And there's probably good reasons for that, given that climate change was not factored into the basin plan. But that's obviously had consequences because the ecological improvements that were predicted from increased flow, while we have seen improvements with greater availability of environmental water, it hasn't been to the level that was hoped for and expected. One of the consequences of having that hard interface with the barrages, now they were built because with the less flow, like I've described, less freshwater flow, the lakes became at risk and were observations of becoming increasingly saline or indeed hypersaline during drought conditions, which would wipe out the freshwater ecosystems. The barrages were constructed to maintain vestiges of their former largely freshwater character, but they did create a very fixed and hard interface. And the sort of issues that John talked about with fish, with barriers to fish movement, this consequences of putting in engineering structures and reducing estuarine and diadromous fish movement across that. And there's also consequences in relating to water movement. There's less of a tidal prison, or the amount that the tide can sort of move back and forth. And one of the consequences of both reduced flow and also fixed engineering structures is there's more salt, sediment and nutrient retention in the system, in the lakes and the Coorong. So we're seeing more hypersalinization, particularly in the Coorong, more sediment retention and more nutrient retention. So we've got a much more eutrophic system with much higher algal levels now, and particularly during drought and low flow periods, that gets to a very extreme and detrimental levels in terms of the ecosystem. With climate change there and the work that's been done, being right at the end of the system, it is very sensitive to reductions in upstream water availability and flow, and some of the predictions are for further reductions in flow due to climate change, which might counteract expected increases in flow availability due to the basin plan. And as it's been mentioned, that really needs to be factored into revisions of the basin plan. And also for this, being the estuary at the end of the River Murray, there's additional risks with climate change relating to sea level rise, where the barrages are able to keep the sea out, but they weren't designed to withstand high sea level rise scenarios. So if sea level rise continues to what predictions are to later the century, then they could be compromised in their ability to keep the sea out. If I go to the next slide, thanks. So what are some recommendations and potential solutions? The lower lakes in Coorong is important for everyone. We shouldn't think about this as a local issue. All the salt, sediment, nutrients that accumulate in the Murray-Darling Basin gets flushed out here. So we really got to think about this as a connected system. It's been talked about and connected for everyone's benefit. Some of the key things are we really need to review, as I've touched on, those environmental water recovery targets. And one suggestion, because as I mentioned, we're not getting the flow, is to actually set defined flow thresholds. So currently the basin plan sets sustainable diversion limits, but they are not set on particular flows, they're on predictions. But if we can set actual minimum flow thresholds that need to be delivered regardless of what the plan says, then that will create more protection for this region and other regions like the Lower Darling. As I mentioned, the barrages in their current form are relatively inflexible, but there's opportunities and there is some automation there, but it is not a lot of gates that are automated. But there is an opportunity to create a much more dynamic and connected interface that could be manipulated on much shorter timeframes than is currently possible. And that would really create benefits for ecological connectivity like fish movement, but also help to get more flushing, but would need to be managed carefully relating to risks to seawater penetrating into the freshwater system. The First Nations integration of knowledge and values has been touched on is really important, and it is occurring to a degree, but we just need to keep reinforcing and empowering local communities in this region to have access to water and what they need to maintain their values for the region. I've touched on climate change, but certainly for this region, with those risks that I've mentioned, we need to have greater consideration of climate change impacts, but also those adaptation strategies relating to obviously flow reductions, but also sea level rise. And as been mentioned by others, that whole of system perspective, the basin is connected, and we really need to consider that connectivity, and not just for the freshwater and estuarine systems. A lot of recent work we've done has shown the importance of the River Murray to the marine ecosystem. Tens of kilometres off the Murray mouth benefits from water and nutrients coming out and providing, sustaining the marine ecosystem. So we'd like to see a greater focus on that whole of system, including those nearshore marine ecosystems, which are also dependent on the River Murray. Stop there, and happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for a presentation that gives a very broad perspective of a very complex part of the environment, yet is really quite significant in the total operation of the river. Now, the difficulty, of course, of the whole Murray-Darling Basin plan has been the impact on producers and the development of sustainable development limits, the concern that producers will have for the future of their livelihood, and really the person who has an experience in dealing with the producers is Carl Larsen. And of course, agriculture is not the only business in the Murray-Darling Basin. There's a lot of other enterprises. Tourism is quite significant. There's some mining and other enterprises. So could Carl give us a perspective of what you see as a longer-term future, which provides for a thriving, capable set of industries over the next 50 years? Thank you, Carl Larsen.
Thank you, John, and thank you to my co-authors and colleagues, Dr. Anne-Marie Boland, Claire Flanagan-Smith and Rebecca Schwarzman, and also our collaborator and long-time colleague, Tim Cummins of Tim Cummins and Associates as well. So thank you for that introduction, John. The industry development and adjustment task that we were set was looking at a 50-year vision for particularly agriculture within the Murray-Darling Basin, and as John's outlined, it is a significant contributor to gross domestic product, with irrigated agriculture being responsible for around 30% of gross value from the basin, but only using about 3% of the agricultural land itself. The current consumptive pool, based on that STL that John mentioned, is about 11 gigalitres per year, and total water use for irrigation is in the range of about 5 gigalitres per year, half of which is coming from irrigation districts or channels or pipes, and about 30% from rivers, creeks or lakes. We know that the water applied by commodity in each of those areas, both the north and the south, southern connected basin, varies considerably, but pasture, particularly for dairy, accounts for about 23% of current total water use, with cotton about a quarter, largely clustered around the northern basin itself. What we wanted to do today was firstly to set the scene around how do you think about some of the potential futures of agriculture. One concept that we've adapted is the futures thinking or cone of futures, which really helps to build resilience to change, both in terms of capacity to either persist, adapt or transform. And one way to think about that is possible futures, so the full range of futures that changes could lead to. Climate change has been one mentioned today from other speakers quite extensively, that it was incorporated into our thinking. Plausible futures, which are futures that we think are actually likely or more likely than just possible. And then also preferable futures, so the futures that we wish to steer towards. Now, we developed up a series of plausible futures for a 50-year time frame. And the reason we developed those was to really encourage different ways of thinking about the future of agriculture and its role in the basin, inspire some development and problem-solving skills, and also focus on the solutions themselves. So the 4 plausible futures that we assessed, the first was base case, so business as usual. The second was drying and contracting agriculture under quite an extreme climate change scenario, and also reduction in the consumptive pool for agriculture. A third future around adaptive and market-driven, and then a fourth, abundant water and agricultural powerhouse. Now, in assessing each of those 4 plausible futures, we looked at a number of critical variables. The first and foremost being water, both in terms of the availability or quantity, considering that there are conveyance considerations depending on the source of that irrigation water, as well as quality, which has been covered quite extensively today. Climate, both in terms of averages and extremes, and what that means for the relative commodity mix. At the moment, we've got quite a strong annual mix of crops in the Northern Basin due to greater fluxes in water availability, and perhaps more perennial horticultural crops, particularly in the Southern Connected Basin, that do really suffer in those drier years when there's a reduced allocation of water. In terms of production systems as well, looking at that current mix of intensive versus extensive, and when we say intensive, those that are producing more from a smaller footprint of land, and requiring more input but greater output in terms of per unit area versus some of those extensive systems. It's also really important to consider markets here, both for the agricultural products, the food and fibre, driven by both consumer preference, but also what the relative export and domestic market needs are as well. The next slide, please. So when we think about our recommendations, our preferred future was one where the agriculture industry works with society and the environment, relying on technological advances and sustainable management practices, and embedding some of those principles of a circular economy. And when we say circular economy, that's reduction of waste, it's recirculating products to their higher value use, and regenerating nature. So going beyond just sustainable resource management to actually regenerating the natural resource base. And there were some key areas in which we thought that could be done. Firstly, around water resource sharing. So actually ensuring the equitable sharing of water in the basin for both communities, environment, cultural and recreational purposes. And adapting to a more secure supply in the south and opportunistic production in the Northern Basin, and working with the environment. Producing more from less, so actually aiming to reduce consumption and produce more with less resources. In some instances, this will actually lead to more intensive production systems with a smaller footprint that I mentioned earlier. Securing domestic supply, and that's food and fibre related. So securing the production of essential agricultural commodities to alleviate geopolitical challenges and supply chain breakdowns, some of which have been highlighted significantly with the recent COVID-19 and Ukraine war issues with supply chain issues, particularly with Australia being in the Southern Hemisphere and an island continent. Thriving export. So this was really around exporting high value products to an increasingly wealthy global consumer that's focused on health benefits and bulk commodities produced efficiently and profitably. We talk about innovation and advanced technology, that red bubble in the bottom there. Using technology and communications to improve efficiency and actually mitigate some of those challenges presented by climate change and variability. This includes things like improved plant and animal genetics as well. A skilled workforce, so actually capitalising on the highly skilled workforce in those regional centres where they're attracted due to the excellent services and community capital. And really looking at that decentralised model rather than centralised. The last point there in the yellow box in the top left of the diagram relates to responding to societal and cultural values. So appealing to consumer expectations associated with changing societal and cultural values, but also a desire for agricultural production to be ethical, safe and environmentally responsible, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN in 2015, but also the broader principles of environmental, social and governance, or ESG requirements and agricultural sustainability. We're seeing more and more now sustainability frameworks that are produced either at whole of sector or industry or particular commodity groups, and continuing those and embedding those principles of circularity that were really well defined by Alan MacArthur in 2022 are really essential to progressing some of those challenges. So in terms of some of the potential innovations and interventions that we could do to achieve our preferred future, which was one of the industry working with the environment and adapting through sustainable management practices, we looked at three main components for each of those 7 factors in the diagram on your screen at the moment, relating to 3 areas: technology, management, and lastly, policy. So for example, with water resource sharing, we looked at technological interventions like infrastructure management to optimise beneficial use of water on farms, but also management interventions like an active water market to ensure water reaches the most appropriate use. From a policy perspective, obviously more water for the environment and cultural use through sustainable diversion limits, and John previously talked about those being based on minimum flow requirements rather than projected estimates as well, which is an excellent point. And just a couple of other examples in terms of producing more from less. I think looking at that management aspect from a change in crop types and what's grown where, and that spatial shift where crops are actually grown, with a reduction in area of permanent plantings, perhaps in the southern connected basin, and an increase in annual crops, allowing for greater interannual flexibility in water use, particularly in the northern basin. More than happy to speak to any of those other interventions or questions that people may have, but thank you, John and Teresa.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and could I thank all of the speakers who have very well kept to their time, but have exposed a whole range of options for the future so that we can take a positive and enthusiastic approach to the further development of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan in the future. Now, I hope you've all been putting your questions into the Q&A, and indeed, if you still have more to add, please do so. But at this stage, I'd like to hand over to Therese to convene the questions and the answers, and the panel of presenters are on hand to respond to whatever you've thrown up to us. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And you may have all noticed that we've got quite a few Johns on the line today. So please be a little specific around which John you might want to target your question to as well. So thank you very much. I'd like to start probably back where we commenced today around water quality. And I'm going to have a question towards John Verhoeven and then John Williams, if you would follow on. John Verhoeven, in terms of water quality, we're getting a lot of indicators from the Basin Plan Review, the Productivity Commission's review, and the early insights paper from the MDBA that water quality is going to have a bit more of an element in the future basin plan. How do you find this? Do you think it's going to go far enough? How far should water quality considerations go? Noting, of course, there's all types of different water quality requirements for different uses and end users. Perhaps you can talk to that, and then John Williams maybe reflect on water quality in terms of groundwater, surface water as well.
Thanks, Therese. I'll preface this by saying that right now, although the plan includes water quality, it's really limited in that the plan includes objectives and targets to ensure water quality is fit for purpose to meet a whole range of uses that I've described. But those targets weren't designed for enforcement purposes because the plan is basically under the Commonwealth, set up under the Commonwealth Water Act, which is focused on quantity rather than quality. So right now, we're only getting limited information or limited application of quality as an issue. In terms of how far it should go, myself and the other two authors believe it really needs to be elevated to the same level as quantity. We're already seeing now that there are some uses that can't be met not because of the water's not available from a quantity perspective, but because the quality is already such that it can't meet specific uses. And as we've indicated in our essay, this is going to get a lot worse with climate change impacts. So we need to raise the level of water quality protection so that we can maximise maximise the water both from a quantity and a quality perspective. And the other point that I'd like to make very briefly is that I suppose we're pessimists to some extent in that we don't think that we will be able to in the future meet all the quantity quality needs, which is part of why some of our recommendations include a far sharper focus on catchment management measures. So it's a mix of looking at water quality, water quantity, and also on land measures and putting that whole mix together to give the best possible outcome.
Thank you. John Williams, the
Yeah.
groundwater surface water.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, it's the interaction with the groundwater and the surface water that does have big impacts on water quality, as you all know. And so one of the problems with the current plan, and I think it's not that difficult to fix, is in the water resource plan is to recognise the connectivity and the role of this interaction in the water quality requirement. And at the moment, the water resource plan doesn't require really detailed understanding of not only the water balance, but the water quality implications of surface and groundwater connections, and particularly the impacts of agricultural and industrial impacts on those recharge mechanisms, and particularly on the interaction into the surface water. So I think it's a matter of having our water resource plans much more quantitatively dealt with, and to understand where the groundwater connections are critical to these and where it's less important, and other factors. The flooding of the floodplain and the recharge mechanism is often important, but it's not the same everywhere. So it's getting to know what is the basic importance of the connection to water quality and to the water use overall we need to do. And I think we can do it.
No, that sounds like a very actionable recommendation and finding, and that's very much what we're looking to provide as we comment in this area from ATSE. John Koehn, you got me thinking a lot about fish and what I might have for dinner tonight, and let's all go fishing. It made me wonder if we needed perhaps a mascot, not carp, to perhaps get the attention of city folk. And I think putting it in terms of relativity around if that occurred in Sydney Harbour or Docklands or the like is quite telling and unfortunately quite true. You did also reflect on a number of restoration programs. I'd be interested to hear a little more around some pragmatic examples of restoration programs to assist fish? And how extensive does it need to go?
Well, it's a big task. You know, we've had over 100 years of, you know, things that haven't been favourable to fish, so it's going to take a bit of time to fix those things up. You know, as I said, there are things like, you know, over 4,000, you know, major barriers and a whole lot of smaller ones in the basin, and you know, these things have been thought about for a while. And there was a native fish strategy, which was run by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It lasted for about a decade with pretty minimal funding to actually do things, but it did quite comprehensively plan what needed to be done. And one of the investments that was made alongside that was the repair of a lot of the weirs along the Murray. And so those weirs needed to be modified, repaired, whatever, for, you know, OH&S purposes. And alongside that, they actually installed fishways. And so we ended up with 2,500 kilometres of the Murray, which all of a sudden had fish passage installed so that fish could move up and down. And that eventually included the at the Coorong as well. So we've ended up with you know, migratory estuarine fish that are now back into the system there, and you know, fish just moving up and down to do what they do and expanding their populations. So the silver perch population that was sort of blocked by Turrumbary largely, you know, now is well above, into the river, well above that that blockage. So I mean, that's a great example. I mean, this was a world-class effort that had ecologists, engineers, operators, you know, fishway designers, everyone working together across the 4 states, as it was then. The ACT didn't have much to do with it, with some science, good science, and some monitoring, and some new technologies came into it. And it was a hugely successful operation. And in fact, it hasn't been given as much credence as it should have been. But that's a very clear example of the sort of things that can be done. I mean, just another couple quickly. You know, there's been, for trout cod, hatchery stocking has been a very successful way of re-establishing populations there. Putting snags back into the rivers has now been proven that it can be done and increases fish population. So not just aggregating fish to those new habitats, but actually increasing populations. So there's a lot that can be done. We have the comprehensive plan. We just need the investment. And I like, you know, the irrigation industry, as Luke's sort of outlined, and more broadly, has really looked at how to try and be sustainable, look towards the future and make those investments. So there's been a lot of investment along with the basin plan into water infrastructure, including STLs, some of which are very fish unfriendly, I might say. We need a similar program that can put some money, not as much as that, into you know, things that are fish friendly, and we can make a difference.
Thank you. And I suppose continuing on from that, and I'll go to Luke shortly, you did mention that having a range of flushing events and different types of watering events that do come and go and replicate more what would happen in an unregulated river with less infrastructure would be beneficial to fish. But I think, Luke, you were also alluding to perhaps the benefits of that at the other end with the Coorong, Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth. Could you describe that in a little more detail as to what you might want to see for some of the kinds of futures that we want at that end of the Murray-Darling Basin?
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, the barrages are several kilometres long. So, you know, they're quite a long barrier over previously what was quite a large, wide interface. There are fishways in the barrages, but they aren't a substitute for open connectivity, and you get some other benefits like I talked about with the tidal prism with perhaps being able to create more connectivity. So, you know, to do that, you know, it needs careful management. You've got risks of salinity. You know, let's say in the recent flood, there was such a big freshwater flow coming down that all the barrages were completely open. Okay, there was all the gates had been taken out, the water, because the flow was sufficient to keep the salt out. But under average to dry conditions, that's not the case. So under those sort of conditions, there's risk that salt penetrates into the lower lakes and harms ecosystems and irrigators. So the concept of more flexible automation it creates more, I guess, periods of time when you could have the barrages open, because currently, while there are a few gates that are automated, it basically requires big trucks out there for days to remove stop logs and things to open the barrages, and that takes a very long time. But with more automation, what we could do is we could open even on tidal cycles that say, you know, the tide's going out, so there's not such a risk of seawater penetrating in. So you could open on the low tide, close as the tide come back in. If there's a storm coming, you could quickly close them when you're expecting a lot of seawater to push in, and you could have monitoring there that could monitor for risks and close automatically. But it would create an ability to just get more connectivity across that interface more often if you had more automated, flexible barrage infrastructure.
And
I think.
Thanks for. Oh, yep. Go.
I was just going to add to that, Therese. I think that's a great example of sort of the complexity of flows, if you like. When you're buying and selling water, or indeed delivering water, often it's a block, a package, you know, whatever, it's 10 megs or, you know, 20 megs a day or whatever it is. The ecosystem doesn't work like that. It's not in straight engineering lines. It's all over the place. And there's a whole lot of cues and pulses and whatever variation in both the short, so hourly, daily, monthly, seasonal, annually, and beyond that, cycles that happen, and they all have a different purpose for fish. So sometimes you only need a rise of, you know, 10, 20 centimeters, and fish will take off. They'll move. And if you're trying to move fish around the system, rather than having it set at a dead level, which most irrigation flows by, if they're bobbling up and down, that can create, you know, a benefit to fish from just getting them to move. So, you know, it's complicated, but we know a lot of these cues. It's yes, it's a bit more work to put it into delivery. Things like automation can make that a whole lot better. But it's trying to reinstate a lot of those beneficial flow components that have been taken out by regulation. That's what will help make a difference.
Yep. And certainly we've been advocating quite a lot for digital technologies and data-driven decision-making. A lot more investment in that area would also yield a lot of outcomes across the entire basin and national water management as well. Something that I've absolutely appreciated across the full essay series is the positivity that we've had, even though there's a lot of, I suppose, impactful negative findings that have occurred over the management of the basin in the past, but we've all remained positive and looked for actionable recommendations that can be put into policy going forward. On that, Luke, I'm just going to take you one step further. I think we are positively suggesting that the Coorong Lower Lakes Murray Mouth is recoverable and can be regenerated, and that further work needs to be done to maybe have a deeper impact and a faster one. What are the three things that need to be done very much immediately in the early parts of the basin plan review?
Yeah. Firstly, I guess when we talk about recoverable, we're not going to get back to a natural system. So we're talking about trying to maintain a healthy system, and the values and the contemporary values, the values that were there when it was established as a Ramsar site in the 1980s, the listed environmental values and the important values to the Nurrunjeri and other communities. So we have seen improvements with more availability of environmental water. The three things we really need to review the basin plan in the context of those end of system flows, particularly in regard to climate change, like others have mentioned, and we need to ensure that those sustainable diversion limits and other targets reflect that risks that are likely already emerged to a degree relating to climate change, given we're not getting the flows that have been predicted. So that's probably number one. I fully support John Verhoeven with water quality targets. The current water quality targets for the end of system are inadequate. There's not a formal monitoring program in the Coorong. It's very ad hoc at the moment. Various government programs come and go, but there's gaps in the data. So water quality targets and then establishing an appropriate water quality monitoring program would be, my second. Yeah, and it's hard. Getting things done in 3 years is probably the hard thing about that question. And just continuing, I guess there's things we can do. That's what we're talking about with barrage operations, trying to make the most of the water we've got and do things smart. And that's being done. We should continue that and take opportunities where it's available to try things, try and use whatever water's available more smartly. And that's, things, how we release water, what times we release water, where, how much water we release at certain times, things like that.
Thank you very much for summarising a pretty simple question into some key quick actions that need to be done. Carl, if we refer back now to the work around industry and the future of industry and resilient communities going forward, I'm interested in unpacking a little more what you see as the role specifically of the Basin Plan in accommodating and providing for resilient regional, rural and city communities across the basin, and how you see different industries or different crops coming and going as part of that equation as well. You might need to break that down if that's too many things in one question.
There's a few things there, but I'll do my best. Thanks, Therese. So to your first question around role of the Basin Plan, I think particularly from a water resource sharing perspective, one of the key policy interventions is actually the continuation of and enforcement of the current MDB plan, but also improvements to the plan. And I think it's just been mentioned by Luke as well, particularly around monitoring and evaluation and adaptive management of that. I think that then informs the response to the second part of your question, which is around what does that then mean for the resultant industries and communities? And in our preferred future, which just to recap was adaptive and market-driven agriculture, I think there's two key things in that title that are worth spending just a little bit of time on. One being adaptive. And so if we look at the commodity mix, I think we're going to see a significant expansion of horticulture in the southern MDB, with an increase in those intensive production systems. Wow. And I think a reduction in some of the pasture irrigation in the southern MDB, just because of the high and low security water allocations shifting more away from the pasture-based systems. I think that growth in annual cropping is going to occur and be more opportunistic in the northern MDB, but I think the role that the market plays around the market-driven component of that preferred future is really important to consider too, about, well, what are consumers actually wanting and what are they buying? And I think if we look at some of those trends around a focus for clean, green and healthy products that actually demonstrate properly their environmental credentials rather than greenwashing, and some of the ACCC reforms that have been brought in about that recently, but also that increased demand for things like plant-based products. Their so what on the ground, I think, will shift the dial on that commodity mix based on some of those other variables that we've talked to.
Yeah, thank you. Good summary to a big question. I'm going to ask each speaker on the line the same question, but you hopefully will all have a different answer or an answer that might build on each other. But what would be your single most significant knowledge gap that you would like to grapple with in addressing water quality, water quantity, particularly in the equity balance across environment, cultural, agricultural, industrial and urban community and other demands and needs of the next 50 years in the Basin Plan? What's your number one knowledge gap, John Verhoeven?
Basically, we don't have enough water quality information. I mean, if we look at the whole of the basin, 1 million square kilometres, the only long-term longitudinal study of water quality is basically down the main stem of the Murray, from just above Hume Dam down to Tailem Bend, and maybe a couple of the tributaries. It goes back to 78, and that's been documented really well by BWAS and Mosley in 2019. That's for the whole of the basin. Now, I know that the other states are monitoring, or the states are monitoring as well. A lot of it happens to be event-based monitoring, and you've got big gaps in it, as Luke indicated. So for me, it's a huge effort to with the limited resources that are generally available, to put together a monitoring program that is going to run the distance in terms of time and cover all the various elements that we're trying to look in this very varied basin.
Yeah. John Williams.
Yeah, well, I think the very important thing to me is to each of the water resource plans that we've got to get in place need to quantitatively link groundwater and surface water and the processes that then determine the water quality as well as quantity. To know where the connections are really important. What flooding routines do we need to recharge the sedimentary alluvial systems that are important to our red gum forests, for example? So to know our quantitative water balance of our water resource plans we've got, and particularly where the connectivity is critical, where it's less critical, and to know where it relates to the recharge mechanisms and discharge mechanisms in our catchments. And that needs to be done with a modelling tools that can actually quantitatively help us get our recharge and our sustainable yields better defined. But it's got to include the flooding routines that we need for the issues that John and Luke have mentioned. It's so important that an interaction between the stream and the catchment and the floodplain be understood in terms of providing ecological function as well as the rest of it. No point having more water if it only stays in the channel. We've got to learn to get it to function into the wetland and its connections to the groundwater in a whole system. That's what we need, and it's quite doable because we've got the mechanism in the risk framework arising out of understanding your water resource plan. Thank you.
Thank you. And with about a minute to go, John Koehn, Luke and Carl, you've got about 10 seconds to tell me your biggest knowledge gap.
Okay, the biggest ecological knowledge gap is around recruitment of small fishes. So how we get all these flow components, the floodplain, all that sort of thing together into that recruitment. The biggest management knowledge gap we've got is making sure that all these other things are included in management, all the values.
Thank you very much. Luke?
Yeah, I think I've touched on it already, but the biggest knowledge gap, I think, for the Coorong Lower Lakes, the impacts of climate change really need to be factored in seriously, not just average flows. We need to look at extreme events like we saw in the Lower Darling. We need to factor in extreme event planning and maintaining protection against extreme events, not just long-term averages with climate change.
Yeah, very true. And Carl?
Two very quick points, Therese, because I know we're almost at time, but building on John Williams' comment earlier, I think that data-driven decision-making, if we can reduce the amount of time between collecting the data and actively managing some of those systems to share water more equitably, I think that would be a very good advancement. I think too, looking at the role of recycling and reuse of current water, particularly within agriculture, there's only 1% of total irrigation water of that 5 gigs that's currently reused or recycled, so a huge opportunity there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as someone who's been a water recycling expert, I certainly would advocate for more of that occurring. Thank you very much to everybody online for being with us for this essay series. As you would see, we're looking to advocate very much for findings and actual recommendations that can be converted into policy and help inform legislation and other guides and codes of practice. We're very much in a hopeful and future forward mindset and looking to support that in a partnership approach that must be cognizant of the equity and balancing of needs across the entire basin plan. For more information both on this and the wide variety of things that the Water Forum has been commenting on, please visit our website for all of our submissions. And finally, I'd like to thank my co-facilitator, John Radcliffe, on this journey of the Murray-Darling Basin project. And a special thanks to the APSI staff, in particular Adam, for all their support in helping to bring this series to light. And yeah, thank you very much and look forward to seeing you all sometime in the basin future.
Well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.